What's up, everyone? It's May here. We're all anti-fascists now. I'm here with Mark Bray, who is a historian. He specializes in human rights, terrorism, political radicalism in modern Europe, all the good stuff, the interesting things that we love to talk about here. And just to, first of all, Mark, thank you for joining us. What got you, I'm just curious, what got you into studying fascism? Because I know you're the author of the Anti-Fascism Handbook, which we'll get into in a second.
Yeah. Well, I've been interested in left politics, radical politics for many years, both as an activist and as a scholar. And if you're studying efforts to make a revolution, efforts to transform society, you sort of inevitably stumble into those powers that have thwarted those efforts. And one of the most extreme examples would be fascism in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So I've been very interested in fascism and how it has tried to kind of steal superficial aspects of the left in its self-creation. And then moving into 2016, 2017, with Trump running for office, the growth of what was then called the alt-right and so forth, a sequence of events led me to write the Anti-Fascist Handbook, and that sort of brought those two interests together.
So the word Antifa is thrown around left and right by the right, and so what exactly is Antifa? You say it's not a single organization, but if you could just kind of define it for our viewers.
Right. So in short, it means anti-fascist or anti-fascism in a number of languages. It's a specific tendency that really probably crystallized in a more explicit sense after World War II in Europe, when there were these debates within the left in countries like Germany or France or England about what to do if there were efforts to create a new fascist party or a new Nazi party. And on the one hand, you have a lot of the socialist and communist parties, which argue that you stop them by making laws against making fascist or Nazi parties. But then you have some of the more radical, anti-authoritarian parts of the left saying, number one, that those laws will be used more against the left than the right. But number two, that these groups will simply change their symbols, change their names, and it won't get the job done. And so the kind of like street level, direct action focused, militant anti-fascism of the post-war period is often referred to as Antifa. And it's kind of this nexus of radical left politics and direct action tactics. And it's kind of a way of doing politics. It's a leftist radical milieu. It's not one specific group. I sometimes compare it to feminism, right? Feminism is not a group, but there are feminist groups. Antifa is not a group, but there are Antifa groups.
Okay, so that's interesting. So what would you say these groups, because I don't necessarily see them out there online advocating for what they believe in, but they're misunderstood in many ways, but what would you say is the most misunderstood thing about Antifa and these groups?
Well, right. You started by saying you don't see them out there that much, and that's true. These days, they don't have a high profile. They were brought into the public spotlight when far-right groups tried to sort of mobilize an independent street presence in 2016, 2017, a little bit in the Pacific Northwest over the next few years. Subsequently, I think they've largely tried to fold themselves into MAGA. And in that sense, the kind of Antifa politics, which was designed to oppose small and medium-sized far-right groups, is not so applicable to a mass movement connected to a political party or president in office. So the misconception part is that a lot of what they spend their time doing is stuff you don't see, is stuff like monitoring far-right groups online, figuring out who their members are and their leaders are, where they work, which other groups they're connected to, gathering that information, in some cases doxing them, although, of course, doxing only works if it's publicly unacceptable to be a Nazi or a white supremacist. And these days, the whole MAGA milieu has pushed back on that a lot, right? And so violence is part of it, right? They do think that it needs to be one of the tools in the toolbox, but is not the part of it that's used most frequently, and these days isn't really used so much at all.
Okay. So, and now I'm here in Los Angeles, and I've been to a few of the protests to cover them, to protest as well. And so the question about agitators, because a lot of the protests have been very, very peaceful. And then there have been a few agitators here and there. Is that, because when I showed up at the protest, there were people who were dressed like they were prepared, like they
Right.
had goggles and they had these gas masks. Is
Right.
that Antifa? Are they trying to instigate violence? Help me understand what's going
Well,
on there.
those are two different questions, right? So, are these people members of Antifa groups? Maybe, but probably not. Most of these groups are pretty small. They require a kind of high level of time commitment and focus. Some have likened it to being kind of like a second job as a private investigator at the far right. So there aren't that many people who are actually part of these groups. Most of these groups have like a dozen members. So chances are no, that those people weren't, but maybe some of them were. The separate question, though, which is probably more pertinent to this political moment, is do people who show up with gas masks or goggles prepared for being attacked by chemical agents by the police, are they, the famed outside agitators? That framework, of course, has been used by the right to delegitimize all sorts of militant protests or not so militant protests throughout history. I don't know the motivations of those individuals, but there are people who have been involved in various kinds of activist movements who show up recognizing that, number one, they don't want to be identified by the police, and number two, they may well get attacked. And then there are some who actually do want to, physically push ICE or the police out of their neighborhood, and that's a part of the, debate among the left is what is the role of those kinds of protest tactics. Members of Antifa groups would be one sort of small facet of the milieu who would think that sometimes is justified.
This is fascinating stuff. So you say that for a lot of them, it's like a second job. What is the average profile? Of an Antifa person? Am I running into them when I'm out and about living my life? Where are they?
Depends on how you live your life, but we'll leave that aside. So it's hard to know because most of the people that are part of these groups are not interested in having their private information known, even by someone like me. So I interviewed some people who I don't know what their jobs are. I don't even, in all cases, know what their race or class background necessarily. There's a really good book written by Stanislav Vysotsky called American Antifa, if viewers are interested, where he did some of those kinds of interviews with some folks, I believe in Portland, Oregon, where he has some more demographic information. But what I can say is that the vast majority of these folks are people that are also doing other left things. These are people who are, in some cases, union organizers or involved in tenants associations, environmental groups, so forth and so on. So if you are an activist who's been involved in a bunch of different stuff, chances are you've rubbed shoulders with someone who's been involved in that and probably didn't know.
So from a historical perspective, especially right now, the title of the show is We're All Anti-Fascists. Right now, fascism has like this stranglehold grip, what it feels like in American politics.
Yeah.
For the average person watching, I think that we hear Antifa and go, what? No, that's not me. I'm not a part of that. What can we learn from these movements historically, and how this can be a part of perhaps stopping these illegal ICE raids and the destruction of our communities?
Right. Well, that's fine. Members of Antifa groups are not saying everyone needs to do what we're doing. And moreover, I think what we need now, as you suggest, is a mass anti-fascist movement with opportunities for all different people to plug in ways they feel comfortable with, in ways that they feel resist this march towards fascism, as you suggested. One thing that I think that the history of militant anti-fascism can show is, number one, the institutions of government sometimes stop this, but sometimes don't. So in the case of Hitler and Mussolini, they came into power legally. When Hitler, pushed forward the Enabling Act in response to the Reichstag fire, that was semi-legal. And in the case of Trump, right, he won the election last time. And he is, of course, breaking the law in various different ways, but the courts are trailing well behind and catching up to stop him. And so the history of the popular anti-fascist movement shows that we can't trust that that's going to be enough, that we need to get out there in the streets, that we need to, escalate our forms of resistance and recognize that if we don't stop this march towards fascism now, then what's happening to migrants from ICE raids could end up happening to anyone who opposes the administration in a few years if we're not out there making it clear that we won't let that happen.
Well, and I think people who failed to imagine that this was a possibility are seeing it right now in the temporary detention of elected officials. This is something that with our own eyes, we have not witnessed. And so I think people are starting to wake up to that. But this is something that's been happening globally as you've studied fascist movements throughout the world. I was just in Portugal, and I happened to be there for their 25th of April celebration. And it was well attended, families, and they were chanting "Fascismo nunca más," fascism never again. And so it's in their DNA to fight fascism because it's so recent for them. So in your exploration, do you feel like the fight against fascism isn't global enough here in the US? Like, it feels very disconnected. Like, MAGA's really good at doing CPAC and all of these things. Do we have that? Were we a global approach?
Not as much as we should. You're right.
Okay.
Not as much as we should. Some of the anti-fascist activists who are part of some of these smaller groups have networks and connections to some of the other groups. But I think part of it stems from your average person who's protesting at No King's Day, as you suggest, is increasingly sympathetic to the notion that what's going on is something approximating fascism. They're increasingly concerned that if we don't stop it now, it's going to get worse. But there's this notion of American exceptionalism, which is mostly historically, just a joke, right? But we're a young country, but our government is one of the oldest in the world, and so there's this like, oh, it can't happen here. And there isn't as much knowledge about how really, like, a lot of what Hitler did was an effort to imitate or copy aspects of how Americans depopulated the West by committing a genocide against the indigenous population, the American eugenics programs, that these were explicitly, it's well documented, influences on Hitler and his development of notions of race and his efforts to create so-called Lebensraum, or living space, for German people in Eastern Europe. So those parts of the story of fascism, like the American part, is not as well known as it should be. And the fact that it very well could happen here, because it could happen anywhere, is not as much in the forefront. And so I think there's this kind of focus on, like, Trump's a bad president, but don't see the roots of this deeper in what America has always been, that this is less exceptional than people would like to think if you look back on the history of white supremacy in this country. And I think understanding that would put the US in this larger context of fascism, imperialism, colonialism, white supremacy that really you can probably trace back to 1492.
Well, yeah, and I mean, today is Juneteenth, so and a lot of people don't even realize that not everybody was liberated with the Emancipation Proclamation right away, and so this idea that it can't happen here, it already did happen here, and so I think some people are starting to wake up to the fact that they are not immune to what's happening, especially communities. I don't know if you saw some of the articles about ICE raids in rural communities like Missouri, and they took Carol from the diner. And the town, which was largely voted for Trump, was like, "No, we thought you were just going to come for the criminals, but you took Carol." Can you talk about how in fascist movements they decide who is a criminal and who gets targeted?
Exactly. So fascists always depict themselves as victims under attack. And so, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, the main boogeyman was the Soviet Union and communism. And you can see equivalent versions of that with McCarthyism, and even with, like, the Klan and opposition to the civil rights movement in the US. Today, who are the enemies? Well, there's all sorts of enemies according to Trump. But in this context, it's immigrants who are depicted as being unwanted. Back, I feel like 30 years ago, the right wing would say immigrants are bad because they take our jobs. They're not even pretending that that's the case anymore. They're just depicting them as criminals, rapists, dangerous people. And that's interesting. The history of the language of criminality is a way of delegitimizing any individual or group. And so you have this whole swath of the country who is imagining that immigrants are overwhelmingly, if not entirely, criminals. But then they have that on one side of their head, and then they have the people they've actually known, who they've seen, like, oh, you're just a person like anyone else. And then, as you said, when these kinds of ICE raids happen and people who they didn't put in that category get taken away, then it really, breaks apart that kind of association. In Germany, with the Jews, one of the most famous examples of like fascist scapegoating, Jews were simultaneously blamed for communism and capitalism, and Jews were less than 1% of the German population, when Hitler took over power. So it's not so much that these kinds of fascist depictions are grounded necessarily in anything. And if you look at the arguments they make, it's just about depictions and isolated incidents. You could have like a leftist scholar analyzing, well, if you actually look at the demographics of migration over time and where people are coming from and the historical roots, et cetera, here are some graphs and charts. And then in the response, one of these MAGA people will be like, well, but look at this video. And that's like a kind of argumentation that isn't argumentation, that rejects rationality, that appeals to emotions and fear, and feels anti-elitist insofar as someone who is not attuned to listening to detailed statistical presentations about history and politics can immediately resonate with. And I'm particularly concerned that in the age of AI, increasingly they're just going to use deep fakes and fabricated videos and images to be able to see, these are what these people are doing. And people who don't have that kind of media literacy won't be able to see through it in some cases, unfortunately.
Yeah, and very few people have that kind of media literacy, and that's a purposeful thing. And so the fact that people are being duped left and right, even now, before AI has truly taken over the internet, is a little scary. So to speak about this the victimization, that they feel that they're the victims. And so it seems like what I'm seeing is that the line gets moved over who gets called a criminal. So first it's like the immigrants who are here legally, but then their status was changed, and so now they're a criminal. But then also now elected officials are moving towards that line. I've seen, if you remember the I can't remember what bill it was, but there was a bill that was looking at making certain nonprofits be labeled as terrorist organizations. Who is anybody safe from being called a criminal in a fascist regime?
Sorry, you broke up a little. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. My
Okay.
question was, is there anybody who's safe from being labeled a criminal in a fascist regime?
Well, what I would say to start is that fascist regimes have had important cores of support, right? So the notion that the fascists will target everyone is not borne out historically, right? If you were, a Protestant, German, middle-class conservative person in Nazi Germany, they weren't going to come after you, right? Every regime needs its base of support. That having been said, what you're suggesting by moving the bar of criminality, moving the bar of repression, and going from saying, okay, immigrants are criminals if they're quote unquote illegal, overlooking, of course, the fact that a lot of people are applying for asylum, which is legal, and you go from saying that they're criminals to saying that we have an invasion, which is what Stephen Miller said when he was trying to argue for eliminating habeas corpus in immigration cases. And then you go from people who are assisting them are criminals or who are advocating for them. You can see how it kind of goes out farther. And in the conversation around crime and criminality, I'd throw the term terrorism. So terrorism, invasion, the insurrection, right? All these kinds of examples of emergency measures that are on the books for cases of exception. These are kind of loopholes for authoritarians to take over liberal democratic states and use them for authoritarian means, which is part of the threat here. So it's clear that if they get their way, then they are going to pursue an agenda of, making America great again, which is they see as essentially a time where what they view as natural hierarchies were restored. Hierarchies in terms of race, gender, religion, class, politics, and anyone who falls outside of those demographics is going to be left with the choice of either having to flee or be persecuted or hide themselves away and say nothing, because that's what these regimes pursue, is that kind of complete either silence or acquiescence. And that's why it's so important that people get out and not acquiesce now, because it's much easier to resist these regimes now before they've become even more powerful and establish themselves even more strongly.
So, with what you're witnessing now with the No Kings protests and the hands off protests, and just in general, the sort of resistance that you're seeing, does it give you hope? Do you feel like it's enough? Is it not enough? What are your thoughts on our chances?
Yeah. So it is encouraging to see millions of people out in the streets. It's very encouraging, and it is a strong rebuke to the notion that most people support Trump, because most people don't. And even the polling on Trump's numbers around how he's handling migration have been declining over time. That having been said, I'm concerned about it not being enough, and I'm concerned about your kind of average centrist or liberal who opposes Trump not being ready for how we may be needing to put our bodies on the line to not only stop ICE agents, but potentially the National Guard or the military if suddenly they start arresting all Democrats, right? Like,
It's like, please say it ain't so.
I mean, because that's the step, right? We're talking about fascism. If you have a full-on fascist situation, the Democratic Party becomes illegal, right? And anyone who supports it is potentially thrown in a camp. We're not there yet,
I was going to
fortunately.
say, I was like, we're not there yet. And historically, there's somewhat precedent for this. Can you talk about what the red lines are, or what things that we should watch out
Right.
for?
So there's a few things that I've been trying to keep an eye on, right? So the gradual, or sometimes not so gradual, expansion of realms of rightlessness, right? Spaces where rights are being eroded. And we can see that around immigrants, the rights to asylum, even the right to due process for someone who is accused of being an immigrant, even if they're not, right? That's being stripped away. And they're being sent to El Salvador, and there's talk about increasing the capacity of Guantanamo, and those would be spaces that would be beyond, American due process.
Okay.
So the stripping away rightlessness and creating spaces where hypothetically more and more people can be shuttled into that kind of pathway towards eliminating rights. The other thing that the fascists did historically is they kind of left the liberal state in place, but they created their own parallel structures. Like the Nazi concentration camp system was not illegal, it was just non-legal. It was outside of legality. And that's essentially what's going on with El Salvador right now. Like, it is that kind of space where when you're sent there, who the hell knows, right? But that could hypothetically expand, and this could all expand much faster in the context of an emergency, even especially one if there is actually a real emergency, right? If there is some sort of terrible natural disaster or terrorist attack, or if Trump actually goes all in this, what seems like he may with this war in Iran, and emergency wartime powers are called upon, and people who are protesting the war are accused as being like, quote unquote, pro-Hamas, which is, of course, always been like a slander and a slur for anyone who supports Palestine. You can see a situation where they try to push through emergency measures to say, we're in a war, we're being invaded, we have these and these kinds of threats and emergencies, so therefore, if you get in our way, you are going to be pushed outside of the American legal system. And of course, the courts may try to catch up, but what if the judges get thrown in jail? What if the lawyers get thrown in jail? It's not that hard to imagine a situation where we go from peaceful protest and the courts to, okay, now we have to like actually fight back, but like actually fighting, like weapons and combat, or we may get killed. Like, we're not there. We're not there.
So,
But
like, I'm taking my pulse right now, Mark, because I do box almost every day, but it's a bag, not a person. So I'm not sure I'm ready to leap to that next level.
I'm not either. I'm not either, and I desperately don't. But like, if we accept the fact that the U.S. could end up like any other country, we look at the historical precedent, we look at the trajectory of authoritarianism we're on, because he's only been in power a few months this time around.
Yeah.
So I think of it like this graph, right? The graph of authoritarianism is going up. The line's going up. We don't know if it'll continue to go up, but if it keeps going up, we know where we're going to end. And that's where we're going to end. And so, one of the anti-fascists I interviewed for my book said, you fight them being fascists. You fight fascists by writing letters so you don't have to fight them with fists. You fight them with fists so you don't have to fight them with guns. You fight them with guns so you don't have to fight them with tanks. And so I'm not saying that anyone needs to get guns or use your boxing skills on fascists, but whatever we can do now to make it clear that we're going to raise hell if this march towards fascism continues, that makes it clear, I think, that there will be opposition, there will be resistance. They can't just do whatever we want. But my 2 cents is yes, the courts have shut down some of the things that Trump has done, but I don't think we can sleep soundly at night thinking that that's necessarily going to be enough without popular action.
Yeah, well, one of the things that concerns me is that the Geo Group, Core Civic, they're building these detention centers, they're increasing capacity. And just logically, I'm like, well, if they're planning on deporting people, how much capacity, increased capacity over 10 years? Who is this capacity for? Is something that I find a bit concerning. Do you have any insights on what they might be building all of that capacity for?
I don't have any more actual detail than you, but let's stop and think of how many people are already just in jail for all sorts of things.
Mhm.
The level of mass incarceration in the US is just off the charts compared not only to other countries today, but the history where like penitentiaries and jails in a modern sense are relatively new. So you keep that in mind, that we've already have this American mindset that it's like okay for millions of people to be locked away, in many cases for rather trivial things like drug possession. And then you have this like concern about emergencies, invasions, terrorism, war. There are these new facilities being built. There's powerful economic interests behind their construction that want to see a greater push towards incarceration. Yeah, I mean, it creates the kind of apparatus necessary to lock up a lot of people. And while we're talking about it, I do think it is worth casting aspersions in the direction of the Democratic Party, who in many significant instances over the past few generations have, in an effort to seem tough on crime, have just pushed these initiatives alongside the Republicans.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned also the economics of it, because a lot of this is inextricable from the economics of prisons, the laws that have been written around mass incarceration. Can you talk about economic crises? And because right now, I don't know what's going on with the tariffs. I can't keep track. But we're seeing industries be affected: the airline industry, travel industry, restaurant industry, to the point that Trump decided to say, okay, actually, we're not going to do raids on restaurants, and then he flipped that around. Can you talk about economic instability and what this all has to do with more fascism?
Yeah, well, when there are tough times, and in a capitalist system, there are regularly tough times for a lot of people, there are two basic explanations, right? One, the left-wing argument is the system's unfair. It should be, in one form or another, more fair. The right-wing argument is it's their fault. And and their fault in many cases is migrants or other countries or what have you. And so you can see with the rise of the far right in Europe, there were not a lot of really big far right parties prior to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And then in countries like Greece, in France, they just kind of exploded, because it's much easier to say the immigrant is taking your job than to get into a whole kind of economic analysis of the causes of economic precarity. Now, the tariffs have been strange, right? Because in a sense, if you just talk to your regular old free market economists, they're going to say this doesn't make any sense. But of course, what's going on with Trump is, to varying extents, depending on your point of view, somewhat fascistic, and fascists have been critical of a kind of laissez-faire free market capitalism and have leaned towards state intervention in the economy. And so part of me wondered, like, is Trump trying to manufacture a crisis economically to go along with this political crisis so that he can have an excuse to do more authoritarian measures? I don't know. That might be giving him more kind of planning credit than he's due. But if people are scared for their livelihood, historically, they often will turn to a strong man who gives them easy answers. But in this case, I'm not sure that that's really going to help. But then again, fascism is a kind of politics that rejects argumentation and rationality and appeals emotionally and viscerally. And there clearly are many people in this country who are buying into that message. And with climate change and climate crisis moving forward, and the kinds of scarcity of resources that we're going to experience around the world, and climate refugees eager to move to somewhere that they can actually survive, I think those kinds of strains around economics and authoritarianism are only going to get worse over the coming generations.
Oh, well, Mark, I like to end the show on a hopeful note, and that wasn't very hopeful. So we're going to keep going. Here's so it's interesting because with climate change, we've obviously now seen climate refugees within our own borders. So we're not, people having to leave Las Vegas because it's too hot, or move inland from Florida because it's too hot and humid and they can't afford the property insurance associated with it. Or I'm here in LA, so the Palisades fire and the Eaton fires. So that's causing mass displacement, mass instability. So none of these things, it feels like are within our control. So we touched on it with the protests, but I want to end with what's within our control.
Right.
People watching, where are the little things that we can do within our control to contribute to the whole resistance movement?
Yeah, what I would say is build community solidarity and resistance in your town or neighborhood or region. We can't, there are big problems in this country and big problems in this world that none of us as individuals or even small groups can really change. But movements are made out of like dense fabrics of groups acting in their capacity on their local level, creating outlets for people who are new to politics and want to get involved, to plug in. And that's the best defense we have if things really get worse, if there are more natural disasters, if there is more scarcity, is helping each other on that kind of local level, and working to create solutions in that way, and not trusting that outside forces are necessarily going to have our best interest, because unfortunately they often don't. So whatever that looks like to you, get involved in your local community and try to build community and forms of support, because that's all we got.
It is all we got. And sorry, one more. We're going to keep going. I was like, I want to end on like this much hope, so much hope. One of the things that has always bothered me is when I was out at the protest, there were plenty of people who were at brunch and not at a protest. Plenty of people who are, head in the sand, have no idea what's going on. Are we going to have to get those folks involved, or do we just have to wait till things get so bad that they get involved on their own accord?
Well, the more people, the better, right? But it is true, the whole like, if Hillary hadn't won, or if Kamala hadn't won, I'd be at brunch, is of course missing the elements of continuity that exist, what we were discussing before, in American history, between what's happening now, happening then, the ways in which both political parties are real part of the problem, if you ask me. And so, yeah, I think we do need to try to educate and politicize among those people more. But ultimately, there's probably only so much you can do until political circumstances or climate disaster circumstances or economic circumstances kind of force more of those people to realize, okay, we have a huge crisis. We need to change how we're thinking about doing politics. Because, during the era of fascism, there were plenty of people who thought that Mussolini would be helpful because he would be a force of order and he would get rid of those, crazy leftists, until all of a sudden their uncle was the one getting thrown in jail. And we're seeing that even with people who, voted for Trump, but their spouse or their brother got deported. That changes minds, and hopefully in a way that propels those kinds of folks to rethink politics and to get involved.
Yeah, I think the more people that are waking up to that and taking that as an opportunity to have those conversations. A lot of people think, oh, someone can't leave MAGA, but I did interview the guy from Leaving MAGA, and people are leaving MAGA. And so that is my hope, is that we don't have to hit rock bottom for that to happen. I thought January 6th was rock bottom, and then it was like, oh no, we were going to keep going lower. Okay, fine. But I don't want us to hit a true rock bottom for us to realize it's time for a change.
Yeah, you fight and build today so you don't get that low tomorrow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Mark, thank you so much. Where can people find your research and your everything? Because I'm not sure how online you are.
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky, Mark Bray. You can check out Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook is available at your local bookstore. And I wrote a few other books that might be fun if you're interested in protest history.
Okay, well, there you have it. Everybody go out, find them on Blue Sky, and avoid X at all costs. All right.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Maya. Take care.
Yeah, you too.